In the heart of a raging nor'easter, one man believed his fortress of steel could keep the world out. Leo, a veteran haunted by ghosts of war, had built walls not just of metal, but of fear. But when a faint whimper pierced the storm, something inside him stirred. An old oath he'd sworn long ago, never leave anyone behind. So, defying the deadly wind and the darkness that mirrored his own soul, he opened the door, not knowing that the sound he followed would change everything. Sometimes miracles don't come with light. They come with a cry in the storm. Support our stories of faith and courage. Subscribe now to keep the light alive. The coast of Maine lay under siege that night. The wind clawed at the cliffs like a living beast, and the Atlantic hurled itself against the rocks with the fury of a god denied. The town of Gull's Haven, a scatter of shingled roofs miles down the coast, had already gone dark, its lamps drowned beneath curtains of rain. But at the very tip of Northcap Point, where the land gave up to the sea, one light still fought against the storm, the beacon of the Northcap Lighthouse. Inside, Elias Ward, 52, a man carved from the same granite that lined the shore, moved with a soldier's precision. Once a Coast Guard boatswain, he carried the storm in his bones, the kind of man whose back never fully relaxed, whose gray-blue eyes seemed always measuring distance and danger. His beard was streaked with silver, trimmed to habit rather than vanity, and deep lines bracketed his mouth from years of salt air and silence. He lived alone, as he preferred it. The locals in Gull's Haven called him the Ghost of the Light, saying he spoke more to the sea than to any living soul. Elias didn't mind. Solitude had become his discipline after a rescue mission gone wrong years ago, a mission that had cost him a crewmate and a piece of himself. Since then, storms had been both punishment and penance. Tonight's storm, though, felt different. The barometer had plummeted faster than he'd ever seen, the nor'easter dragging a howl through the iron beams of the tower. The lantern glass trembled. The scent of ozone and salt filled the narrow stairwell. Elias checked the generator, tightened the hatch bolts, and whispered to no one, "Hold together, old girl." Outside, the world was obliterated, just wind, water, and darkness in motion. Then it came. A sound that did not belong to the storm, a faint, broken whimper carried through the gale. He froze. For a long second he thought it was memory, some ghost of the sea calling back to him. But there it was again. Fragile, desperate, alive. His rational mind barked, "Stay inside." Yet another voice, older, sharper, forged in uniform, rose from within. No one gets left behind. Elias turned toward the heavy iron door, hand trembling on the latch, staring into the shrieking black beyond. The light flickered once, like a heartbeat, as he whispered, "God help us both." Morning arrived slowly, dragging a pale light across the battered cliffs. The storm had passed, leaving the sea swollen and bruised, its surface rolling with exhausted fury. Inside the Northcap Lighthouse, Elias Ward moved through his morning ritual with mechanical precision. He brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint, his hands steady despite the tremors of fatigue. The lightkeeper's quarters were small, a single bunk, a metal table scarred with burns from oil lamps, and a wall of meticulously labeled tools. Every item had its place. Order was his fortress against memory. Elias was a man of angles and silence, broad-shouldered, wiry, his skin weathered by salt and wind. He moved like someone who had learned that stillness was safer than conversation. His reflection in the fogged window showed a man who looked older than his 52 years, the ghost of discipline etched into every line. At noon, he logged the previous night's readings, noting the wind speed and barometric pressure with the precision of a soldier recording casualties. Below the cliffs, the town of Gull's Haven blinked to life. The church bell tolled faintly through the salt haze, and in the far distance he could see the thin plume of smoke from Henderson's general store chimney, his only tether to the world beyond the sea. Henderson, a stout man in his 60s with a face like an overripe apple and eyes too kind for gossip, sometimes sent supplies up the path with local boys. They called Elias the Ghost, and he never corrected them. Fear, he knew, was easier than pity. Occasionally, through the spyglass, he caught glimpses of people staring up at the lighthouse. There was May Collins, the harbor master, a tall woman with auburn hair tied in a scarf, her face carved by sun and years of wind. She carried herself with the calm of someone who'd seen too many storms and too few good men. Once, she'd waved. Elias hadn't waved back. He didn't hate the town. He just didn't trust himself near its warmth. The sea had taken something from him long ago, something he still refused to name. That night, he ate soup straight from the tin, the steady rhythm of waves against the rocks filling the silence. The storm's echo still lingered in the beams, whispering through the cracks of memory. Elias glanced at the heavy door that faced the sea. Somewhere out there, the sound he'd heard still haunted him, a reminder that even silence has weight, and sometimes it presses hardest when the world is calm. By the third evening, the horizon had changed its color again. The sea, once silver blue beneath the winter sun, had turned the color of old iron, rippling with warning. Elias Ward stood on the narrow balcony beneath the lantern room, his oilskin coat snapping in the wind. He could read the weather the way other men read a prayer, by instinct, by the tightening of the air in his lungs. The barometer in the kitchen had fallen another inch since dawn. The nor'easter was turning back, or perhaps it had never really left. He muttered to himself, "She's coming around again." His voice, hoarse and low, was swallowed by the rising gusts. Inside, the lighthouse hummed like a living thing. Elias moved with quiet efficiency, checking bolts, sealing the narrow windows, and stacking fresh logs by the iron stove. Each motion was part of a sacred ritual, order against chaos. He replenished the lantern oil, his fingers steady even as the glass rattled in its brass frame. The smell of salt, steel, and kerosene filled the air. Outside, the sky darkened to a bruised purple. The gulls fled inland, and the first drops of freezing rain struck the metal roof with hollow, deliberate taps. As he worked, the generator coughed and sputtered, a warning of its own. With a grunt, Elias crouched beside it, sleeves rolled to his elbows. His forearms were corded with wiry strength, veins standing out like blue threads against sun-browned skin. He'd rebuilt this machine more times than he could count, and it had become his companion of sorts, temperamental, stubborn, yet loyal. He spoke to it under his breath, coaxing it back to life the way a priest might whisper to a dying soul. When the engine finally steadied into a rough, rhythmic hum, Elias exhaled and wiped the grease from his palms onto a rag that had once been part of a uniform shirt. Through the thick glass of the lantern room, he caught sight of a flicker below, distant headlights moving along the coastal road. Someone was heading toward Gull's Haven, too late to beat the storm. He thought of warning them, but stopped himself. The town had never wanted his voice, only his silence. The wind shifted again, blowing from the east, sharp and cold as a blade. The storm was building, but it wasn't just the clouds that unsettled him. It was the feeling that something was coming for him, something carried by the wind itself. He turned the last bolt on the door, listening to it click into place. Outside, the sea roared. Inside, his heart echoed it. The storm broke for only a moment, like the sea pausing to draw breath before striking again. Elias Ward stood by the narrow observation window, the beam of the lighthouse cutting thin white blades through the fog. The wind had dulled to a moan, and in that brief silence he heard it. Faint at first, a sound that didn't belong to the sea. A bark, then another, short, desperate, and uneven, carried between the crash of distant waves. He froze, the lantern light trembling across his weathered face. His first thought was that it couldn't be real. No creature would survive out there. Yet the cry came again, weaker this time, threaded with a whimper that reached somewhere deep in him, he thought long dead. Grabbing his oil lamp and a coil of rope, Elias pushed open the heavy iron door. The wind clawed at him instantly, stinging his cheeks with salt and sleet. He descended the slick stone steps carved into the cliffside, his boots striking sparks from the wet rock. Below, the tide churned violently against the seawall, throwing spray high enough to sting his eyes. He swept the lantern beam across the shoreline, and there it was, a flash of motion beneath the jagged rocks. A small black and white border collie, tangled in a mass of rotted fishing net, its fur soaked and clinging to a thin frame. The dog couldn't have been more than 2 years old, with the alert, intelligent eyes typical of its breed, now dulled by exhaustion and fear. Each time the surf hit, it struggled weakly, only to be dragged tighter by the mesh. Elias waded into the freezing surf without hesitation. The cold bit like knives, but he moved with grim purpose, the instinct of rescue overriding the years of silence that had kept him apart from the world. He reached the dog and knelt, his rough hands working quickly through the wet cords. The animal whimpered, then stilled, as if recognizing something in his voice when he muttered, "Easy, I've got you." One last tug, and the net gave way. Elias lifted the shivering creature against his chest, its heart fluttering wildly against his coat. The sea surged once more, nearly knocking him off balance, but he turned and climbed the rocks with the strength of a man who refused to let the ocean win twice. At the top, breathless and soaked, Elias pushed through the lighthouse door. The storm screamed shut behind him. The little collie trembled in his arms, eyes half-lidded but alive. For the first time in years, the keeper of the Northcap light wasn't alone with the wind. The world narrowed to salt, wind, and pain. Elias Ward's breath came in ragged bursts as he anchored the rope around his waist, testing the knot with the precision of an old seaman. The cliffs below the Northcap light were a maze of black stone slicked with algae, sharp as broken glass. Waves slammed against them with the force of artillery, each one threatening to tear him loose. He leaned back into the descent, his boots scraping for purchase on the wet face of the rock. The storm had returned in full fury, screaming through the gaps in the stone like a living thing. The lantern strapped to his shoulder flickered wildly, casting flashes of gold across the dark surf below, where the border collie still struggled against the remnants of the net. The dog's cries had grown weaker, a hoarse rhythm of pain and obedience. Even half-drowned, there was discipline in its stillness, an echo of training, of trust once given and perhaps betrayed. Elias's eyes, narrowed against the spray, locked on it with the same focus that had once guided him through rescue missions gone wrong. He reached the ledge, rope biting into his waist, and dropped to one knee beside the trapped animal. "Hold on, boy," he murmured, his voice low but steady. His hands, calloused and strong, worked the rope and torn nylon free, fingers bleeding where the salt cut them open. The dog's fur was slick and heavy, a patchwork of black and white matted with seaweed. Its ears twitched as he spoke, and when the last strand gave way, the creature let out a shuddering breath, collapsing against the rock. Elias gathered the limp body in his arms. The dog's weight was nothing compared to the sea pressing against him, but every step upward was a battle. The rope strained, the wind roared, and the waves clawed at his boots. For a brief second, his foot slipped, and he dangled above the foam. The dog pressed against his chest like a fragile heartbeat. Then, with a surge born of memory and defiance, he pulled himself up, hand over hand, until the iron platform of the lighthouse came into reach. He rolled over the edge, gasping, the cold air tearing at his lungs. Inside, the door slammed shut behind him with a sound like thunder. Elias set the border collie down beside the iron stove, wrapping it in a coarse blanket. The animal's sides heaved as it fought for air, but its eyes, deep, dark, and wary, found his and held them. Elias knelt there, shivering beside the creature, both survivors of the same merciless sea. Outside, the storm howled its rage, but within the golden circle of firelight, two living souls shared the fragile warmth of survival. The storm finally lost its fury, leaving behind a hollow quiet that felt almost sacred. Inside the Northcap light, the air smelled of salt, smoke, and damp wool. Elias Ward sat beside the iron stove, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a kerosene lamp flickering nearby. The border collie, now freed from the cold grip of the sea, lay on a folded blanket near the fire. Its fur, once slick and dark, had dried into a soft, uneven halo of black and white. There was a faint scar across its front leg, an old wound that told of another struggle before this one. As Elias dabbed antiseptic on a fresh gash along its flank, the dog's muscles twitched, but it didn't pull away. Its eyes, deep, intelligent, and steady, watched him with something sharper than fear. It was judgment, the kind of gaze a creature gives when deciding whether to trust again. Elias recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror for years after coming home from the Coast Guard, the look of someone who had survived but hadn't quite returned. "You and me both," he muttered, voice gravelly with disuse. The dog tilted its head slightly, as if listening. He wrapped the bandage firmly but gently, his rough hands far more patient than his words ever were. When the work was done, he sat back, studying the animal. "You're a fighter," he said softly. "Guess that makes two of us." Later, he set an old pot over the stove, the smell of fish and rice filling the narrow quarters. It had been years since he'd cooked for anyone but himself. He ladled some of the porridge into a metal bowl and slid it toward the dog. The collie hesitated only a moment before lowering its head to eat, tail thumping weakly against the floor. That small sound, soft, rhythmic, alive, filled the room more completely than any human voice could have. Elias smiled faintly, the expression awkward, as if it had forgotten how to find its way to his face. Before turning in, he built a makeshift bed out of old wood panels from a dismantled dashboard, lined with canvas and a scrap of wool blanket. The dog circled twice, then curled up inside it, breathing deep and even. Elias leaned back in his chair, listening to the fire crackle, the wind whispering faintly through the beams. For the first time in years, sleep found him easily, drawn by the simple proof that he was no longer alone in the dark. Morning came with a pale light that crept through the narrow windows of the lighthouse, touching the rough floorboards and the sleeping form beside the stove. The border collie stirred first, stretching its long legs and letting out a soft groan as if waking from a long, heavy dream. Elias Ward knelt beside it, fresh bandages and a small tin of salve ready. The air carried the scent of salt and ash, mingled with something new, the faint warmth of companionship. He murmured, "Let's see how you're doing, soldier." His voice still coarse but quieter than before. As he loosened the wrappings around the dog's ear, something unusual caught his eye. Beneath the fur, on the inner flap, was a faint, almost invisible tattoo. SAR K9-17, the mark of a Coast Guard search and rescue dog. Elias froze. His breath caught in his throat as old instincts stirred. He traced the faded letters with a calloused thumb, and memories rose like ghosts from the sea. Missions in the dead of night, storm warnings, radio chatter that ended in silence. This animal wasn't a stray. It was trained, disciplined, once part of the very world he had turned his back on. The dog looked up at him, alert, as if recognizing the change in his tone. For the first time, Elias spoke the truth aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "You were one of us." The words hung heavy in the still air. He sat back, eyes unfocused, the sound of the waves outside blending with the echo of orders long past. Somewhere along the coast, someone must have lost this dog, or abandoned it. The thought struck deeper than he expected. Looking at the collie, its gaze steady and unafraid, Elias felt a pang of kinship he hadn't felt in decades. They were both castaways from duty, survivors of things no one else wanted to remember. By noon, the sky had cleared to a fragile blue. Elias stepped outside briefly, the cold wind sharp on his face, then returned to find the dog standing on shaky legs near the door. "You're stubborn," he said with a faint grin. "You'll fit right in." After a moment of silence, he added, "Harbor, that's your name." The collie tilted its head, tail giving a single wag, as if accepting the title. Elias poured fresh water into a bowl and scratched gently behind its ear, right where the tattoo lay hidden. The lighthouse had once been a place of warning, but now, for the first time, it felt like a harbor. 3 days passed beneath the winter sun, its pale light reflecting off the endless gray of the Atlantic. The storm had left scars on the cliffs, pools of brine frozen like glass, gulls circling aimlessly over the restless surf. Inside the lighthouse, Elias Ward was mending a section of wire along the stairwell when the sudden bark of Harbor shattered the quiet. It was sharp, urgent, a sound not of play but of alarm. The collie stood by the doorway, ears pricked, tail stiff, staring toward the western cliffs. Elias set down his tools. "What is it, boy?" The dog barked again, then bolted through the open door. Elias followed, the cold biting through his coat as he trudged along the rocky path. The wind carried Harbor's voice, echoing across the crags. When he reached the edge of the western bluff, he saw the dog pacing furiously near a narrow drop, its paws slipping on frost. Then Elias heard it, a human cry, faint and hoarse, buried under the hiss of the tide. He crawled to the edge and peered down. Wedged in a crevice 20 feet below was a young man, maybe 25, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him, his heavy jacket torn at the shoulder. "Hang on!" Elias shouted, his voice steady but firm. The man looked up, eyes wide with pain and disbelief. "Thought no one'd hear me," he gasped. Elias tied his rope to a rusted mooring hook and descended carefully. Years of muscle memory guided him, his body still moving with the precision of a rescue diver. The injured man's name, as he soon learned between breaths, was Cal Fisher, a local fisherman who'd gone out early to check his traps before the next storm. He had a boyish face despite the roughness of sea work, freckles dusted across his nose, and the awkward gratitude of someone unaccustomed to being saved. Harbor crouched above them, whining softly as Elias worked. Using 2 broken pieces of driftwood and strips torn from his undershirt, Elias fashioned a splint and wrapped the leg tight. "Keep talking to me," he said. "Don't fade." Cal nodded, teeth clenched, trying to obey. Once stable, Elias keyed the old emergency radio strapped to his belt, a relic he hadn't touched in years. Static roared, then a voice answered. Within minutes, the Maple Coast rescue team responded. They were on their way. When they arrived, their leader, Captain Rourke, a broad man with silver stubble and sharp, observant eyes, examined the splint and let out a low whistle. "Clean work," he said. "You've done this before." His gaze met Elias's, curious but respectful. "You served, didn't you?" The wind whipped across the cliff, carrying the unspoken truth between them. Elias said nothing, but Harbor pressed closer against his leg, as if answering for him. 2 days after the rescue, the lighthouse stood quiet again, its walls humming with the slow rhythm of wind and sea. Elias Ward was repairing the latch on the northern window when the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears. An unfamiliar intrusion. Harbor's ears perked up, tail twitching once before settling into an alert stance by the door. Through the misted glass, Elias saw a figure approaching, tall and deliberate, wrapped in a long navy coat that flapped against the wind. When she stepped into view, he recognized May Collins, the harbor master of Gull's Haven. May was in her mid-40s, strong and striking in the way of women who had long made peace with hardship. Her auburn hair, tied into a rough braid, was streaked with silver near the temples, and her weather-browned skin bore faint traces of salt and sunlight. The wind had carved lines around her eyes that now studied the lighthouse keeper with an expression of calm understanding rather than fear. She carried herself with authority, but not arrogance, the kind of woman who gave orders on a dock but listened when the sea spoke back. Elias opened the door halfway, the habit of caution still etched into him. "May," he said with a nod. She smiled slightly. "So the stories were true. You pulled young Cal Fisher off the cliffs." Her voice had the steady cadence of someone used to shouting over engines and waves. Elias shrugged. "The dog found him. I just did what needed doing." May stepped closer, unbothered by his reserve. "You've done more than that. The town's been talking. Captain Rourke says you worked like one of his own." She paused, glancing around the forge-like interior, where old steel parts hung on pegs and half-shaped sculptures stood in quiet defiance. "You build things?" Elias hesitated, following her gaze. "Scrap. Keeps the hands busy." May nodded thoughtfully. "Then bring something to the Snowfish Festival this weekend. People should see what the man who saved one of theirs can do with rust and fire." The words hit him harder than she likely intended. He started to decline, but before he could, Harbor trotted over and rested his head on Elias's knee, eyes lifting with quiet insistence. May noticed and smiled. Seems he agrees. For a moment, the sound of waves filled the silence between them. Then Elias exhaled, slow and measured. "Maybe," he said. It wasn't a promise, but it was the first time his voice bent toward yes. The morning of the Snowfish Festival dawned clear and sharp, the kind of cold that bit without mercy but glittered beautifully in the sun. Down in Gull's Haven, blue and white streamers fluttered between lamp posts, and the smell of salt, fried fish, and wood smoke mingled in the air. Children darted through the crowd in bright scarves, their laughter chasing the gulls from the docks. Elias Ward stood at the edge of Main Street, Harbor at his side, watching as life unfolded in colors he hadn't seen in years. His heavy coat was dusted with frost, and under one arm he carried a small hand-built model, an iron and brass lighthouse, no taller than his forearm, its gears whirring softly as it turned. A crank on the side powered both the tiny light atop and a small radio receiver built into its base, a machine designed for both beauty and use. When May Collins spotted him, her face brightened. "You came," she said, voice cutting through the din. Elias only nodded, setting his creation on a wooden table among the local craftsmen's work. People stopped to look. The simplicity of it drew them in. The little lighthouse glowed against the winter light, its beams sweeping across curious faces. Elias kept silent, his hands in his pockets, while Harbor sat loyally at his feet, tail curled neatly around his paws. As the festival wore on, the air filled with music and the clatter of boots on cobblestones. A group of elderly townsfolk gathered near the square's center, listening to a local fiddler. Among them was Mrs. Agnes Brower, a widow in her 70s, known for selling seashell trinkets near the docks. She was short, wrapped in a faded red shawl, with hair white as the tide foam. Suddenly, as she stepped forward to applaud, her knees buckled, and she crumpled to the ground. For a heartbeat, the laughter froze. Elias was already moving. He pushed through the crowd, Harbor trotting beside him, barking once to clear the space. Kneeling beside the old woman, Elias checked her pulse with practiced calm. "She's breathing," he said, his voice steady. He loosened her scarf, raised her legs slightly, and shielded her from the cold wind with his own coat. The crowd murmured, eyes wide with the realization that this was no accident. He knew exactly what to do. Moments later, Mrs. Brower stirred, blinking in confusion as color returned to her cheeks. A hush fell. Then someone began to clap. The sound grew until the square filled with applause, not the raucous cheer of entertainment, but the quiet, grateful rhythm of respect. May's eyes met Elias's across the crowd. For the first time, he didn't look away. Harbor wagged his tail once, proud and content, the guardian of a man who had finally stepped back into the light. The days after the Snowfish Festival carried a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. Winter still gripped the coast, the air sharp with salt and frost. But for the first time in years, Elias Ward found the silence of Northcap light no longer heavy. It was full of presence. Down in Gull's Haven, word of the keeper's return had spread faster than the tide. Fishermen who once turned their eyes away when passing the cliffs now waved from their boats. Even children, curious and unafraid, dared to climb the path toward the lighthouse, their laughter carried by the wind. One crisp morning, Elias stood before the western wall of the lighthouse, hammer in hand. Harbor watched from the snow-dusted grass, tail swaying in an easy rhythm. Piece by piece, Elias built a small wooden porch from reclaimed boards washed ashore, some pale as bone, others darkened by sea and time. It faced the town instead of the ocean, a quiet declaration that he no longer needed to guard against the world. Above the door, he mounted a hand-carved sign, the letters uneven but steady. Northcap Light. When the wind dies, hands turn. The phrase came to him the night before, half memory, half prayer, an old motto of the rescue crews reminding them that when storms end, people must still work to rebuild. By noon, the first visitor arrived. Tom Branson, a middle-aged fisherman with sun-reddened skin and the weary eyes of a man who had seen too many winters at sea. He brought a blueberry pie wrapped in cloth. "The wife said you earned this," he said gruffly, setting it down. Elias nodded, unsure how to respond. Before he could speak, Harbor rose, padded over, and nudged the man's leg gently, earning a chuckle. "Smart dog you've got there," Tom said, scratching behind Harbor's ear. "Name suits him." More visitors followed over the next days. Children spinning the little crank on Elias's model lighthouse, women leaving jars of preserves, old men sitting quietly on the new porch sharing stories of storms past. Each time someone came, Harbor wagged his tail, watching with that calm intelligence that seemed to mirror his master's change. For the first time since he'd come to the cliffs, Elias sat on the porch with his back to the sea. The lighthouse still watched the horizon, but its keeper now faced home. The final night of winter came soft and clear, the kind that carried no wind, only the slow breath of the sea. The stars spilled across the horizon like grains of salt scattered by an unseen hand, and the waves murmured against the cliffs below Northcap Light. Elias Ward sat on the porch he had built, its wood faintly creaking beneath his boots. Beside him lay Harbor, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert in that watchful, loyal way only dogs possess. The glow from the lighthouse wheel rotated above them, cutting slow arcs of gold through the dark, while the distant town of Gull's Haven shimmered faintly under the starlight, its windows flickering like lanterns adrift on calm water. Elias had grown leaner that winter, though not weaker. The lines on his face had softened, no longer carved by solitude but by something gentler, acceptance. His beard was flecked with white now, his hands rough but steady as he rubbed Harbor's fur absently. The dog huffed contentedly, a warm puff of breath in the cold air. From somewhere down the hill came the faint echo of a fiddle. Perhaps the tavern by the docks was alive again with laughter. He thought of May Collins, the harbor master, her voice steady and sure as she'd said after the festival. "You kept the light for the sea long enough, Elias. Maybe it's time you keep it for the people." He hadn't answered then, but the words had lingered like tidewater in stone. Above them, the beacon turned once more, steady and sure. Elias looked toward the horizon, where the dark of the ocean met the glitter of the stars, and felt something stir deep within him. A light not of duty, but of belonging. He reached down, scratched behind Harbor's ear, and said softly, "We're not alone, old boy. We were never really alone. Just keepers, waiting to find someone to share the flame." Harbor lifted his head, pressing close, and together they watched the sea breathe under the sky. A man, a dog, and a lighthouse that no longer guarded against the world, but welcomed it home. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles in thunder or fire. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through a wounded dog washed ashore, through a man who thought his purpose had ended, through a single light that refuses to go dark. Elias Ward once believed he was the last keeper of a forgotten lighthouse, but he learned what all of us must someday remember. The true beacon isn't made of glass or steel. It burns within every heart that still dares to care, to rescue, to rebuild. Maybe tonight, in your own storm, you can be that light for someone. A kind word, a helping hand, a prayer whispered for a stranger. It all matters more than we think, for the God who calmed the sea still works through simple acts of grace, through people who don't give up when the wind howls hardest. If this story touched your heart, share it, so its light can reach one more soul. Leave a comment below and tell us, what harbor in your life has reminded you that hope still exists? And before you go, subscribe to our channel, because here every story is a small miracle, and every viewer helps keep the light alive. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his light guide you through every storm, and may your heart, like Northcap light, never stop shining.